We're going to do some calls and what were some conversations. And today we're going to start with a conversation with Paul Jacob. Paul was involved with the term limits movement going back to the beginning, and he was actually the president of United States term limits or U.S. term limits for several years. And he worked on the initiatives that went around the country and other things. So today we're with Paul Jacob of the Liberty Initiative Fund. And Paul and I are going to talk about some different things dealing with initiatives going back to the start of the term limits movement. So we're just going to have a conversation, Paul, and let people know, anybody who wants to view and see some details going back on this. So when exactly did you first get involved in initiatives, I should ask, and then we'll go from there. Then we'll discuss the different term limits initiatives. So what's your history, your beginning in the initiative process?
The first initiative I did was called the Tax Accountability Amendment. It was in Illinois in 1990. And while I was doing it, a friend of mine, Mike Ford from California, would call and we would compare notes. He was working on Prop 140, which was the term limits initiative in California in 1990. And so that was really my first brush with term limits. And we would kind of compare notes. In 1990, there were three measures, term limits measures on the ballot. There was Prop 140 in California. That got the most press because, of course, California being the most populous state. And that was fought tooth and nail by Willie Brown, who was the long-serving Speaker of the House, maybe not so affectionately called the Ayatollah of the Assembly at the time. And Brown raised about $6 million. They ran
That's some serious change.
Yeah, they ran wall-to-wall television ads against the amendment. No TV in favor of the amendment. There was a small radio buy to promote Prop 140, and yet against that onslaught, Prop 140 won. And that really sent a message around the country. There were two other states that helped send a very strong message in 1990. Colorado, which was the first state to limit its own congressional delegation. They not only limited their state legislature, they also put a provision in that limited their delegation to Congress. And that really touched off the national effort to limit congressional terms. And the other one was Oklahoma, which actually was the first term limits initiative voted on, because in the Sooner state, the governor can set the measure at any election.
Oh.
And the governor, instead of putting it on the November election, I suspect there were some state legislators and federal legislators who encouraged him not to put it on the same election where they were up for a vote. And so they voted on it, I believe, sometime in September, and all three measures won. And then, of course, U.S. term limits formed in 1992 and really spearheaded 14 states on the ballot. That's the most states to ever vote on a single issue in a single cycle like that. The previous most was, I believe, 11 or 12 states that voted on nuclear freeze proposals, some of them advisory. But this was 14 states, including California, Michigan, Ohio, Florida, very large states, and a ton of publicity. And we were fought in a number of different states, big fight in Michigan, big fight in Washington State, big fight in Arkansas. In many of the other states, I think they looked at the polling and said, we can't stop the term limits juggernaut. And we ended up winning in all 14 states. The average margin of victory was 2-1. And so that really put a ton of pressure on the Congress. And of course, in 1994, we came back with more states. There were another 8 states that passed term limits initiatives, and that really helped spur, Newt Gingrich and Republicans in the Congress who had been out of power for 40 years endorsed term limits as part of their contract with America. But that was almost entirely because they saw the power of this issue There were so many candidates running on it, so many candidates talking about, and these are challengers because in 1994 there were 77 new people who came into the Congress, and they were talking about the people in grocery store parking lots collecting signatures in the hot sun to put these measures on the ballot, and those initiatives were the closest thing in American history to a national referendum. And that national referendum was 14-0 for term limits.
Yes, it was very huge victories that year. I know I was too young to be actively involved with petitioning at that time. I was in high school. But I have talked with a lot of people who were actively petitioning at that time. And from those initiatives, a lot of different things have happened in the in the citizen government, putting things to direct democracy world. But some of those initiatives, like California, I think it was 140, and then 190 was 190 the one that followed it up for Congress. Do you know?
164.
164.
Yeah, that was, which was in 92.
Some of those initiatives have been back and forth in the courts. I was just reading recently that the California initiative was tossed out in federal court, and then the Federal Court of Appeals, of course, said no, and they overturned the decision from the first time it was tossed out. And then, of course, in 1995, when they tossed out the congressional portion, then that portion was tossed out. But California still does have term limits. Before that, was there just kind of staying on the initiative topic? Before that, was there a lot of organized initiatives in the states that you remember back in the 80s and whatnot? It seems to me, looking at history, that it's a relatively newer phenomenon, as organized as it has been, but maybe that's just because of my involvement that I know of the newer stuff. But I don't really get the feel that in the 70s and 80s, for the most part, there was a lot of organized initiative stuff. Everybody who has been in it for a long time that I talked to remembers getting started with the term limits initiatives. And of course, petitioners love term limits. It's, the one you can always open with, and voters always want to hear about it. But do you know, were initiatives or as organized in the 80s as they are not in the 90s?
Well, there was a big jump in the 90s. And I think a lot of that was due to term limits doing so many initiatives in the 90s. But part of the reason that I think you had a lot more initiatives, including the term limits initiatives in the 90s, than you had in the 80s and 70s and 60s, when the initiative process was not used nearly as much, is that you really saw at the end of the 80s, the end of the Cold War. And politics became a lot more about Washington and the state capitol and city hall than it was about world, the Cold War and the Soviets, and we began to focus a little bit more at home, and after decades of Cold War, and frankly people didn't like what they saw, and so they took some action. But if you look back a little further in initiative and referendum, you find that in the teens, the 1920s and 30s, there were a lot of initiatives. The 90s was probably the biggest, and I don't know for certain, but I believe it was the biggest number of initiatives of any decade, even since. But there is some ebb and flow, and I was surprised in doing just a little research. Even during World War II, you saw initiatives in a number of different states, not at the same level as maybe before, but at probably a stronger level than during the 60s and the 70s, when it seemed like there weren't as many initiatives. Of course, there were some big ones. In 1978, you had Prop 13, which got a ton of play around the country, and really, in many ways, some people have pointed to that as the beginning of Ronald Reagan's campaign and the momentum that helped carry him to the White House in 1980, which is pretty consequential stuff. But what oftentimes people don't know about Prop 13 is that not only did it win 2-1, did it win against a ton of money, but after it won, it had a tremendous impact, not just in California, but all over the country. There were over 40 states between 1978's election and the 1980 election that passed some sort of tax reform or tax cut in their own state. So it really did spark a tax revolt. And sometimes you can look at the sheer number of initiatives, but there are other times where it's the importance of that initiative. And the reason I point that up is because I think term limits is an issue that people can see very quickly is the sort of reform that's not ever going to happen if you don't have the initiative process. That, I shouldn't say not ever, but it makes it much, much tougher to convince legislators to limit their own terms than it is to go convince the people that this is the reform needed. And so the initiative process was just an essential element in bringing term limits to the public.
One thing, looking back at the initiative process, a lot of initiatives today seem to be non-organic in how they get their start. There's very big organized lobbies that go out and raise money. But we talk about term limits and U.S. term limits being involved with 14 in 92 and 8 additional in 1994. But I think all of those are initiatives that started at the grassroots level in the states, and then they were well on their way, and U.S. term limits came in and assisted them and helped with the organization. And one of those things where everything's kind of coming together, and somebody is going to end up on point and being out there in front and being the spokesperson nationally, even though they're spokespeople in states and whatnot. But for the most part, these initiatives, came by organically in the states when it comes to term limits, which is something that's not particularly common. A lot of times it's led by in Prop 13 in California, I'm pretty sure there were some politicians or people who wanted to run for office who led the charges on those. But for the most part, term limits didn't have that leadership. It was citizens coming together. Are there any stories that stand out in your mind about that?
Yes, and I'll just correct you a little bit. Prop 13 was very organic, did not have many elected officials who supported it. It came from the public and had very little political or media support, which was one of the reasons it was such a surprise when it won big. Term limits initiatives really were popping up all over the place, and term limits efforts, sometimes they were lobbying their legislature or they were trying to figure out what to do. But this issue just inspires a ton of grassroots involvement. And it is true that in most of the cases, there were already initiatives going before U.S. term limits really got engaged. I worked for a group, Citizens for Congressional Reform, as their term limit project manager back in 91, before I joined U.S. term limits, before U.S. term limits formed. And so I was working some of that. And there were certainly times where somebody wanted to get something going, but just didn't have the connections, and we would help connect them to other people. There's all kinds of ways that these things take shape. But in terms of the idea and the impetus for it, it came from the grassroots. And it was amazing that it seemed like, overnight, everybody had the same idea. Let's term limit Congress. So it is unlike a lot of other efforts. And certainly there's nothing wrong with an issue that somebody from somewhere else suggests to someone, and they go, oh, that sounds like a great idea. I want to do it in my state. But term limits was a little different in that it was just popping up everywhere, and not just at the state level, as you well know, popping up at the city level. One of the biggest initiatives for term limits was in 1993 when they put it on the ballot in New York City. And, because Congress had been controlled for so many decades by the Democrats, a lot of times Democratic opponents would say, oh, this is a Republican plot. Well, you can't win big in New York City and claim it's a Republican plot. It also won in San Francisco and an awful lot of other cities that were, very much Democratic strongholds. So here was an issue that is coming from the grassroots in places like Wyoming and Idaho, and Arkansas, and then it's also coming from the grassroots in New York City, in San Francisco, and so on and so on.
Yes, there's a lot of examples of that. I think the most recent place where it was a statewide passage of term limits was Nebraska in 2002.
I think it was either 2000 or 2002.
2000 or 2002. They had to run it twice. But we're seeing it in the main reason we don't see more of them is because every state that has that process is pretty much past term limits. We saw an initiative in Illinois in 2012 that then they were able to throw out in the courts. But that was a citizen-led popular initiative to institute term limits on their state legislative officers. But every year and I get calls on a regular basis from people who are doing term limits in their municipalities, people are doing term limits in their counties for different boards and other things. It is a very populous thing, and it's still going on to this day. People see.
And let me touch on something. You're right there. I mean, the truth is it'd be on the ballot and win in other states if they just had the initiative process to be able to do it. I mean, New York, Illinois. And Illinois, they've tried several times, but that process is so limited that every time it gets on the ballot, it's at 75 or 80% in the polls, and then it's sued, and they say, oh, no, you can't do it. But the people want to do it. And I just wanted to touch on, you mentioned Nebraska and said, I think we had to do it twice. And I just wanted, without taking 6 hours, to explain the history of Nebraska, because it's fascinating. And it's somewhat unique in being maybe the worst place in terms of the difficulty in getting term limits passed, but it's not all that unique. And here's why I bring it up. In 1992, term limits was put on the ballot in Nebraska. It won with 68% of the vote. It was then sued with the people suing, saying that we didn't get enough signatures because the Secretary of State and the Attorney General and everybody else, including the author of the amendment that had been made years prior, didn't know what they did and somehow changed the signature requirement. The signature requirement in Nebraska was always the vote for governor. You had to get 10% of that. Well, this court decision, which took everybody by surprise, said, oh no, that's the wrong number. So even though it was the number that for years everybody had gotten and put things on the ballot and passed them, they pretty outrageously in court changed that number to be too high. Had we known, of course, we would have gotten a higher number, and threw out a vote of the people.
They threw it out after it had been voted on?
After it had been voted on, saying we didn't get enough signatures, even though we got all the signatures that state officials said you had to get.
That's pretty outrageous. You don't see that very often, where they throw something out once it's been voted on. Normally, the process requires it beforehand.
Yes. In fact, there are some states that say once it's been voted on, you can't throw it out for any signature irregularity because the people have already spoken now. But that was just step one. That was 92. This decision came with 6-8 weeks left before the next deadline. They held it for a while. And we decided, to heck with it, we're going to try to put it back on the ballot. The folks in Nebraska were gung-ho to do it. We thought that we could help them do it. And we launched a campaign. I still remember the Secretary of State saying that it would take a miracle to get the signatures that quickly. Well, a miracle happened. We got the signatures that quickly. We put it back on the ballot. It won again with 68%. And so we then, it sued again. After the Supreme Court strikes down the congressional limits, saying that states can't do that, you need a constitutional amendment, it's sued again. And in the lawsuit, they say, oh, the people were too confused. They didn't know whether they were voting for Congress or for state legislature. They wanted the limits for Congress, but surely they didn't want them for the state legislature. They threw the second victory in the trash. The Supreme Court ruled that the people were too confused, doesn't count, throw it out. In 1996, there was a retention election for the Supreme Court, state Supreme Court justice who wrote that decision. Never in the history of Nebraska had a Supreme Court justice been defeated for retention. Usually they get 60-something% retained. People, don't pay that much attention to those elections. In 1996, we ran a campaign to deny that judge retention. He was denied retention. He didn't get 60% for retention. He didn't get 50%. In fact, he got 32%, meaning the same 68% voted no. Not only did that mean he was off the court, but the day after the election, a fellow justice announced his resignation in the wake of all this. So it had a big impact on their Supreme Court. Just as an aside, I was there years later when there was an effort against Iowa justices on retention, and they were running ads in Nebraska reminding people this wasn't about them. This was about somebody else. So the judiciary in Nebraska, I think, got a message that you can't play these kind of games. We then came back in 2000, I think, or 2002. I think it was 2000. And for the third time, passed a constitutional amendment to limit terms in Nebraska. And that one was sued as well, but the court decided there'd been enough, and they let that one stand. But it's the kind of thing where, it just again and again, you have huge swerving outside the lines from a legal standpoint, a political standpoint, almost anything to stop this issue, because they recognize the people love it. It's simple and straightforward. There's no complexity really. But it's a great reform. And as much as people sometimes, it's a meat axe approach. The idea of term limits is as old as democracy itself. Aristotle and the ancient Greeks first dealing with democracy supported term limits. Thomas Jefferson said we shouldn't ratify the Constitution because it didn't specifically have term limits in it. This is, it's an issue that has tremendous support, but you can see the kind of machinations that politicians and unfortunately sometimes judges will do to try to block the issue. And of course, the only other place that comes to mind, well, actually, now that I think a couple places come to mind, but in Nashville, we passed term limits. I say we, I mean, the people in Nashville petitioned it on the ballot. I got to cheerlead, but I was cheerleading loudly. And they passed it in 1994, 70-something% yes. They have now voted since that time 7 more times, each time voting against the council's effort or a council member doing an initiative to put a repeal on the ballot or a weakening. So it shows the kind of give and take that there's been on this issue, with the voters putting term limits up, passing them, and then facing every sort of onslaught you can imagine.
Yes, term limits obviously very popular with the people, not so popular with the politicians. I think everybody who votes for it understands why. Thank you for joining us today, Paul. This is Paul Jacob with the Liberty Initiative Fund, and I'm Scott Tillman, the National Field Director at U.S. Term Limits, and we're talking term limits with Paul Jacob. We'll see you soon.